Okay, class, welcome to Unit 2, Lesson 8. This lesson mainly focuses on the Articles of Confederation and some of the weaknesses outlined within the Articles of Confederation. Starting off with some of the weaknesses that we've talked about in class already, Congress had no power to tax the colonies, which led to a multitude of problems, including the fact that they couldn't pay the soldiers fighting in the Revolutionary War. They asked the states to collect taxes for them so that they could pay the people that fought for the war, and they ended up not really getting much money for it, about 15% of what the soldiers were actually due. Now, Congress could make agreements with foreign nations, but they had no power to force state governments to follow those agreements that they had made. So some states imported goods from foreign nations and then refused to pay for them, and there's no way the federal government could force them to pay for those goods. Also, Great Britain closed the West Indies from the United States after the Revolutionary War, meaning that a lot of merchants that used to trade with the West Indies to get basic goods couldn't do that anymore. Congress had no power to make laws regulating trade among the states. So you had problems with interstate commerce, which is why you see the Commerce Clause come up in the Constitution, which is drafted later, saying that the federal government does have power to regulate interstate commerce. What I mean by that is, if something's made in one state and travels into another state, the Congress has the ability to regulate that product. And a lot of those are regulated by executive agencies, such as, let's say, the Environmental Protection Agency, OSHA, organizations like that are made to regulate interstate commerce. Congress had no power to make laws directly regulating the behavior of citizens. So states wanted to disobey rules that were outlined in the Articles of Confederation. They could simply do that. There was no way for the Articles of Confederation to redress those problems. So things like the Treaty of Paris in 1783, they couldn't enforce what they wanted to in the Treaty of Paris. Okay, so next we are going to talk about some more weaknesses and problems specifically relating to the lack of central authority. First of all, the Treaty of Paris said that loyalists would be protected. States simply didn't obey this. What was a loyalist? A loyalist was somebody that fought in, or maybe not fought, but aided the British in the Revolutionary War and lived in the colonies. So obviously that was a problem with a lot of the states because they did not want to support these individuals. Secondly, you had localists versus cosmopolitans. Localists were farmers that racked up huge amounts of debt during the war. Cosmopolitans lived in seaports and large towns and cities. Localists lived mostly on small, self-sufficient farms, and some states passed laws canceling their debt because they made up the majority of the population, so they canceled the debt. The problem was they owed the cosmopolitans the money. So the debate was over whether relieving the debt for the farmers so they could continue to produce products and hopefully be self-sufficient, or allowing wealthy bankers to simply take this debt from them in the form of their land and their property. And we'll talk about Shays' Rebellion a little bit and how this boils over. So the cosmopolitans were often the creditors that loaned the money to the localists. And so they obviously wanted redress for their grievances. Lastly, some people argued this was too much democracy. America was largely an uneducated, unsophisticated world at this time. So when you grant too much democracy, you put too much power in the hands of the individuals without a central figure kind of guiding them, kind of this Hobbesian theory of natural rights philosopher of having someone in control with more power directing the citizens. It ends up having majority rule unchecked, which basically means if you're in the minority, you don't have a say, you don't have any rights. So that was another problem with the Articles of Confederation and the way power was derived in it. Next, we have what attempts were made to solve the problems with the Articles of Confederation. So first of all, there were several discussions trying to amend the Articles of Confederation. The biggest problem was it took all 13 states to agree on any amendment. Well, so therefore, no amendments were ever passed because no 13 states could agree on it. Some people began looking outside the amendment process to address these problems. Those people were called Federalists. They wanted the Constitution, and that's why we drafted the Constitution. They actually met in Annapolis before the Philadelphia Convention, but didn't have enough states to really carry a strong meeting, and they essentially agreed to meet again at another time to draft a Constitution. First tried to address this issue at the Annapolis Conference. Like I said, only 5 states showed up. They tried again in Philadelphia, May 17, 1787. 12 states showed up. The one state not showing up, Rhode Island. Of course it's Rhode Island. It's always Rhode Island. So they didn't show up, but everybody else showed up ready to amend the Articles of Confederation. And then once they showed up, they essentially scrapped these and went straight into writing a new Constitution. Okay? So now on to the last slide here. The thing that really sprung us into passing and ratifying the Constitution and showing the Articles of Confederation was insufficient was Shays' Rebellion. So this guy, Daniel Shays, was a farmer from Massachusetts, and he was obviously one of those localists that was upset about farmers' debt going to cosmopolitans. It took a drastic event for people to realize that change was necessary. Shays' Rebellion was this event. The Articles of Confederation government was obviously not strong enough to put down any insurrections that happened within the colonies. Because Daniel Shay, they called themselves the regulators. These Massachusetts farmers that were facing serious economic issues they all fought in the war, and they never got their wages. So they obviously racked up debt because they were promised wages that were never paid. So a lot of these guys were losing their farms. So what does Daniel Shays do? He takes his men, and they capture the arsenal at Springfield, Massachusetts, where the arms were kept for the state militia. Now, they failed in their attempt, and the state militia did put down the rebellion, but many were worried that this would continue to happen if the central government couldn't step in and solve the problem. So George Washington and many other famous politicians and revolutionaries agreed that this event proved that change was finally necessary. Okay? So hopefully you guys enjoyed the remaining of that lesson.